Welcome, everyone. We are here for the next session, a discussion between Mel Edwards, the global CEO of Wunderman Thompson, Bob Bejan, a person from Microsoft with the longest title I've ever seen in the history of corporate titles. He is the corporate VP of Global Events, Production Studios, and Marketing Communication at Microsoft, which kind of has to be explained all by itself. And then as well, the fabulous Christina Mallon, who's the head of inclusive design at Wunderman Thompson. And they're going to be talking about the power of inclusivity to drive innovation and creativity. Welcome, Mel, Bob, and Christina.
Thanks, everybody. I know that it's, for me, having been up since 3 o'clock, I feel like I should be having a cocktail now rather than sort of like cruising into lunch, but that's just maybe me coming from the UK. Before we begin, should we just, do you want to just talk around your role, Bob, at Microsoft? And I think what's interesting, and everyone will know the story already around how the culture has changed at Microsoft, but really how inclusivity is absolutely intrinsic in that. So maybe just touch a little bit about your role,
Sure.
and then a little bit around how inclusivity is touching you on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so I'm a boomerang at Microsoft. I was in Microsoft in the old days, in the 90s, and the early 2000s, got to start the digital business there with MSN, and then came back, and the ad business as well, back in 1998. But came back 4 years ago because my boss, Chris Capicella, the chief marketing officer, really had this idea about the evolution of marketing to say, hey, look, at Microsoft, and really you can argue kind of maybe at any modern company, there are kind of 3 types of marketers. Product marketers, people who are kind of managing the product and influencing engineering and building those products. And then the thing that Chris calls, kind of the marketing engines around advertising, communications, and experiential marketing events. And that's really my area of expertise and my responsibility. But that really, what it means is that we've really centralized those functions and we service the entire organization. 5 years ago at Microsoft, every single group was doing their own events, for example, and now we've pulled all that together as the pendulum has swung from local implementation or siloed implementation to a centralized world. And so, the events team, our studios, and all of the media production we do, we run a pretty significant studio footprint at Microsoft. And then the communities groups, the ERGs that work at Microsoft, special interests, various groups at the company, all sources for inclusion, the second part of your question. I think if Chris was sitting next to me now, and often when he gives speeches on inclusive marketing, a key thing that we're spending a lot of time with at Microsoft, I think he gives a lot of credit to the events team as being kind of leaders. And in some ways it was easy for us because we were so in front of the customer journey, and with live experiences, you spend so much time, right up against your customer. That it started to occur to us, really about 3.5, 4 years ago, that there was a lot we could do to make our events a lot more inclusive. And then I think he grabbed onto that and used that as an example to help kind of propel the change management of the rest of the company.
Mm-hmm. Christina, would you mind just giving the audience a little bit around your story and your role that you play at Wunderman Thompson?
Yeah, so I kind of have a unique story. So about, 9 years ago, I woke up and I couldn't use one finger. And then about every year until now, I've lost the ability to use my hands and arms. Now I'm completely paralyzed in my arms, shoulders, and fingers. And I was working at Gray at a WPP company. And I thought, wow, I'm making ads that I don't even see myself in. And that was hard because I was a part of the problem. So I took some time off out of the ad world, created an incubator at MIT and Parsons, where we use inclusivity to drive innovation. So we have product designers, fashion designers, physical therapists, working together to create wearables for people with disabilities. And after I learned how to create inclusive products, I thought, okay, maybe it's time for me to go back into advertising. And I had this great opportunity to work on Tommy Hilfiger Adaptive, which is the first clothing line for people with disabilities. There's more clothing lines for dogs than people with disabilities. And that really took off and kind of created this spark within Wunderman Thompson and WPP. So I sat back and kind of talked to the leaders and people like Mel and said, hey, we can do this with every single brand. We need to make sure as brand partners that our brands are representing the culture as it is, that 1 in 5 have a disability. There should be 1 in 5 people in an ad that has a disability. And right now, I'm just working to champion inclusivity with the brands that we represent at Wunderman Thompson, but then also making sure that we're creating products that are innovative. And I think when I look at the work we're doing, it's extremely innovative, and being inclusive has led to some of our greatest work at Wunderman Thompson.
Mm-hmm. And I think we were talking earlier a little bit about, if you think about maybe 15 years ago, maybe longer, we as an agency would get a brief, and there'd be a sort of a MB at the end. Think about how this should show up in digital.
Right.
Come up with a
30-second spot.
Come up with a big idea, but think about what does the banner look like? And I think in a little way that to be absolutely honest with you, I think we still sometimes think about that around inclusivity. Come up with a big idea, but MB, do we need to think about inclusivity in this brief? And actually, I think, the key thing now, and we've already heard, Lindsay was talking about inclusive design earlier. There was a session, a panel yesterday with the head of CES around exclusivity with Facebook and others. And actually, everything, good inclusive design is the right design, full stop. So maybe on that note, if you don't mind, both of you just talking a little bit maybe about the partnership that we have as Wunderman Thompson and Microsoft around this whole agenda.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So really, when I look at kind of where my knowledge came from inclusive design, it really started with Microsoft. Jenny Lee Fleury, who runs accessibility, has been my mentor. And I think, her main goal is making sure that every product at Microsoft is accessible in every experience. And my main goal is making sure that every marketing piece that comes out in the world represents people with disabilities in the correct way. So we kind of do these opposite things and thought, let's work together because we have all of the same clients. And then we can make a larger impact on the world. And I think, that is something, we've been talking about, and we are going to try to do early 2020 is find a client that is open enough to really come in and do some change management, and we can help.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable. I think what's happened for us as a company, right? And I think, look, being involved in the ad business for a long time, at the digital transfer, in a lot of ways you can make an argument that advertising business was first to the digital transformation just out of necessity. And I think, there was a big change in the way salespeople engaged, 10 years ago to now, as we had to shift from going, hey, here are the products and the banners and buttons you can buy, to here are the solutions you can really, here are the stories that we've been able to build and the best practices and this kind of thing, consultative selling in much more of a way. And I think this has totally been true at Microsoft in the last 4 or 5 years, where, our corporate sales organization has had to make that transformation. Because people go, okay, I get it, the digital transformation is happening, but tell me what to do now. Mm-hmm. And I think this model of storytelling about our experience as a roadmap for transformation of any kind is an incredibly effective way to engage if you're a company like ours. And inclusivity ends up being the exact same thing. And I think this is what we're seeing, right? People want to be told the story of like, well, what did you do? And what's the checklist? And what do you think about? And it's an incredibly valuable conversation to have.
And Bob, from an events perspective, you sort of like sponsor, own the whole events organisation, Inspire.
Yes, all of them.
How have you been driving sort of an inclusivity agenda around all of your events? Because it's not you do so many events globally.
Yeah,
I can't even remember
2,800.
Crazy. And so therefore, how do you manage to put that into the DNA of your organisation and your people, I guess? So
it started very simply, right? I mean, at first, we started thinking about, and again, it's just like everything, right? You get driven by what you're told. And, we obsessively read all of the evaluations of these events and the verbatims we were getting. And we started to see kind of these repeating verbatims of like, hey, you're not giving me what I need. And it started with, kind of hard of hearing or deaf. And we started kind of going, hey, we're going to do, closed captioning.
Yeah.
And like that was our first kind of foray into inclusive creation of any kind. And what was wild is two things happened. One is that we got enormous credit for doing that among the deaf community,
Yep.
the hard of hearing. But the other thing that happened is that we started to see like, hey, when you start to kind of focus on maybe the minorities, people who can't hear, you end up doing a huge favor to a much bigger group of people, because we started hearing from people who had English as a second language, and all American presenters speak too quickly, and all of a sudden we started getting all these verbatim comments going, God, thank you so much for these closed captions, because even though I can hear, I can now understand what's being said because English is my first language. And so that's what got us on the journey as an events team. And then it very quickly went from that to kind of starting to explore the ideas of how do you really deal with deeper explorations of our audience, right? And we started to think about, hey, a lot of engineering people, no disrespect intended, but many are on the spectrum of autism, for example.
Yeah.
Where the events that we throw actually are quite threatening and hostile to them, right? The noise and the cacophony of it all. And so literally now in all of our expos, we have, kind of roped off sections of the floor filled with kind of, therapy animals that people can kind of come and take a break.
And when you say therapy animals, what are we talking? We're talking sheep?
Sheep and cats and rabbits. And now I will tell you, we used to have horses. A year ago, we started at Build and we had small ponies, but they were loved too much and now they're in therapy. It's very sad. But, things like that, you would never think of. And another example is we now do at our parties and celebrations, we only do a silent disco.
Yeah.
Again, it's kind of partly it says, hey, more variations in music, and you can pick what you like. But for those people that are kind of overwhelmed by that kind of noise, incredibly helpful, and you get a lot of credit for it.
I love that. And I think one of the key I guess, points that we really talk to our clients about is that this isn't not-for-profit, pro bono. This is firstly, it's a big audience.
It's $6.8 trillion in buying power.
Yeah, I mean, that's crazy,
right? It's
a
crazy amount of money.
Yeah. And I saw a stat a few months ago, about 70% of all consumers, will only consider brands that are inclusive. And therefore, with that much buying power, everything we do should, have some element of inclusivity. How do you think we should go about... So if you were a brand sitting in the audience or a client that, hasn't thought about that, it might be, there's that word that's ringing around the agency or in the client. How should we go about helping address that or, for clients in the audience now?
So I'll be interested in what you have to say. But I mean, I think, look, there are some very kind of checklisty things that you can start to do. I mean, we all have digital presences. We all have websites and web pages. I mean, just a simple inventory on, is your hero image in high contrast to the background color so that it's easy to see and understand?
Yeah.
Does every photograph on every web page you have a descriptor in it so that people without sight can understand what that image is? Does every button on your web page have full functionality and description so they know what the function is, so that if you have a reader on your web browser, it can be you understand what button you're pressing? I mean, listen, for Microsoft, that was probably a good 18 months of work.
Yeah.
Where you and it made a huge difference in the accessibility of our websites, and shockingly low percentages of those photographs, those buttons, those contrast hero images were done correctly, when we started that process. And so I think just simple things like that are huge, and they create a virtuous cycle.
Yeah. Christina?
Yeah. I mean, besides hiring Wunderman Thompson to do it for you and Microsoft.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think, I always say, it's extremely basic. Having closed captioning on things works for people like me when I can't put my headphones on. I can at least enjoy a movie on the plane. Really tiny things, as Bob just said, is the way to start. When I look at ads, I mean, every ad that you should create, it should be 1/5 should be people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. There's more redheads in ads than people with disabilities, and there's less redheads than people with disabilities when you look at the numbers. So I think really looking at that and hiring people with disabilities to help you. I think a lot of the brands that I meet are very scared. They don't want to offend anyone. But if you don't take risks, you're not going to be innovative. If we look at, some of the largest innovations in the world, touchscreens created for people with disabilities, self-driving cars, voice control, all created for people with disabilities because we were designing for the edge case. So, you really just need to bring people into your organization and experts. And I think, I'm happy to help with that for sure.
And I think on that point, I guess risk, because there's nervousness, I think, as anybody around the language, even to have a conversation around inclusivity and what that means, and making sure that, because you don't want to, to be absolutely honest, you don't want to people don't want to feel foolish around it. So absolutely. I think sometimes because of the nervousness around what they should say, how they should say it, the conversation just isn't had.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we, help unpack that and just make it part of the day-to-day.
Well, I have a very good teacher, and my boss lives an example very well. So I give credit to him completely. But I think, to your point exactly, I mean, I feel it all the time. I mean, it's a scary thing to be saying the wrong thing and then be straightened out. And, you don't have to read too many pages or, screens of news to kind of go to the next case of exactly that. But I think one of the things we've been really kind of focusing on as leadership at Microsoft, and I think it's true for everybody, is A, the courage to make those mistakes, and B, the example first. And then this understanding that it's like the mistakes are going to come. It's like riding a bike on the street. You're going to fall, right? The key is, how do you get up from that? How do you respond to that? How do you take it on board and learn in an equally kind of public and transparent way? This notion of the repair work in any of these kinds of evolutions is almost more important than the progress you make is really true. And it needs to be, you need it tone at the top, and middle managers and team leaders need to really have the courage to face that themselves and fly their own plane into the side of a mountain and make a mistake, but also kind of respect and kind of, praise people that are willing to take that risk and let it be seen and put a name on it.
And I think on that note, it could be even as small as having something within people's KPIs, so it helps drive that behaviour change sort of instantaneously, rather than it's you're thinking about it, but it's not necessarily touching your day to day. On that note around, I guess, taking risks, maybe making some mistakes, what would you say? What have you experienced, Christina, in terms of maybe not wanting to, be too honest, but from maybe a Wunderman Thompson perspective, where do you think we have made mistakes around this?
Yeah.
Just going on that journey.
I think sometimes, we'll make the mistake thinking that we know everything. And, how I was hired and got brought into advertising was, we won the Tommy Hilfiger Adaptive. And we were going right into actually shooting concepts. And then they hired me, and I said, guys, has anyone with a disability reviewed this? How are you so confident this is gonna do well? And then I asked Tommy, and Tommy didn't have anyone with disabilities helping create the clothes. So I kind of put, the stop button on that, and we kind of re-looked at everything that we were doing. And what we did, we created an incubator of 1,500 people with different disabilities and their loved ones, and then started from the beginning, had them look at the clothing, make sure it actually works for them, and then look at the advertising, help them concept their ideas. And then when we were putting together the creative, we said, oh, wow, we have Golden Globes and different types of really great directors that want to do this work, but why don't we have a disabled director? And we had a blind director, and we had all cast with disabilities, and the production crew were all people in the disability community. And that created the great work, and that's why we won a bunch of Cannes Lions. And I think...
And sold the product out within how many days?
Yeah, they sold the product out within a month.
Yeah.
And they actually, 30% of the calls to Tommy were to say, thank you for the clothing. No one ever calls customer service to say thank you. And it's just because we looked at the CX, and we did a journey map before we started all of the work, and we consulted with people with disabilities. And it was just so important, and I thank people like Mel and Shane for, putting me in that position and trusting my kind of expertise and guts. And I think that was a huge effort of why we made good work, but we knew what we didn't know.
Yeah.
And we realized that, and we kind of made that change afterwards.
And I think that, that was, I think, let's be honest, we worked in a slightly, we made some mistakes.
Yeah.
And then had to go back to the client and have a difficult conversation to go, that work that we've sold in and you love, and you're all behind it. we want to scrap that and start again because we've approached this in the wrong way. And that was a hard conversation to have.
Yeah, and I think that they really appreciate it at the end, and that's why we keep getting more business from them, and why they talk about Wunderman Thompson at their all-hands meetings at Tommy Hilfiger, and they really see us as a partner, and we're on their actual website, which is crazy. That it really works out when you have these truthful conversations and do that due diligence, and I think that really worked out in our favor.
And Bob, I mean, not wanting to open that up and talk about,
huge
maybe
gaffes that we've made.
Yeah, but why don't we?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, I think apropos of where we're sitting and everything, maybe a great story to tell, and this is not so much about disabilities per se, but certainly inclusion. Nobody will be surprised to say that as an industry, and certainly at Microsoft, we are very focused on bringing more women by percentage and, in rank into our organization, in the industry in general, right? And 2 years ago, we made a decision to move our global sales meeting as well as our global partner meeting here to Las Vegas.
Yep.
And, if any of you are producing types and are do events and this kind of stuff, this is the wonderland of producing. So from a production perspective, we were beside ourselves with our partnership with Caesars and MGM, and we're thrilled about doing it. We threw this great show over in the T-Mobile Arena and everything, but really missed the whole point of kind of going, hey, to speak about women in technology, inclusiveness, trying to raise the percentage of women in our populations, that maybe this is not the most hospitable environment for professional women to be doing business in. And we heard a lot about it after the first year. And it was really
from our
people. Partners and from our own people of how could you be more against the values of the company, and really penetrating and very unvarnished feedback about our short-sightedness. And, it really it made us step back and a lot of reflection and kind of like, how do you respond?
Yeah.
What do we do? And the happy ending is that we kind of took that voice, and we talk a lot about this idea about empathy comes from proximity, and so we kind of took those collective voices and a lot of the male and a few of the people that were willing to come with us, and we came back to Las Vegas and met with all of the key executives of both of the hotel chains that we're primary partners with, and said, hey, we want to form a culture council with you to see what we can materially do in this city to make this a more hospitable environment for women. And what was amazing about it is by tapping into that, first, we were able to diffuse a lot of the, irritation, anger, and energy that came from our kind of tone deafness. But it also made this connection with this community where they were like going, we're hearing this from a lot of people, and you're galvanizing a reason for us to try and do something. And it produced a lot of positive output. And, in the following year's execution, we got a ton of positive feedback in recognition of the changes we've made, and now we're now in a position where we can commit to a number of years more here, and we really feel like we're making progress. And so I think a good story there about hey, walking straight into the side of a building, but then stepping back and going, okay, what do we need to do to make this right and make the right changes?
I love that. And how are you sort of broadcasting, communicating that maybe internally, the whole ethos and culture around, what you're doing as a business? Because those sorts of stories, you're like, I like that. That makes me feel proud to be part of Microsoft in terms of how you're driving that agenda. I
totally agree. And so it's awesome in the sense that we are functioning in this culture right now where, starting with, Satya and the SLT, the senior leadership team, there is an opportunity to get visibility there. They, in turn, are carrying this message. I mean, literally, Chris, my boss, Chief Marketing Officer, does an inclusive marketing presentation that he's kind of on a roadshow in the company, but also doing out in public, where he talks about the work we've been doing with events and that kind of stuff as an example of how we started, certainly along with the Xbox controller that we did this last year as well, several other examples. But it now becomes kind of the part of the narrative of it's at one time evidence of what we're trying to do to change our culture, and it's changing the culture.
Yeah. I love that. Christina, why don't we maybe just unpack a little bit about how we come up or think about inclusivity maybe at Wunderman Thompson, because it's not one department, right? It's everyone's role to think about that. How are we doing that? I sort of know the answer, but why don't you touch upon, unpack that a little bit for us?
So we think of inclusive design as better design. So when we design, we think inclusively naturally. So it seeks through everything that we do. We also look at it from a CX experience. So really, it's kind of in every single department that we have here. It's not just in HR. When we look at kind of who's the consumer, we're not just looking at ourselves. We're really looking at people with disabilities, females, kids, the aging population, instead of just looking at maybe a main customer. And then when it comes to innovation, we really think that by being inclusive leads to innovation. And I think what's really great is we help Tommy Hilfiger create some of their adaptations. And those are just better ways of dressing. So really, I see it in every single department that we have. And what I try to evangelize is that inclusivity should not just be in HR, and it's not just for people with disabilities, it's for everyone.
And what brands or businesses would you say you feel are doing it well?
I mean, besides my favorite, Microsoft.
Apart from our favorite client.
I mean, they're the best.
Yeah.
I would say Ari, which is a brand from American Eagle. I think they are just doing such a great natural job of making sure that they're inclusive in their brands from their imagery. And I think, you're catching teen girls right at that age where it's really tough being a teen girl, and showing that body positivity that they're doing is really important, and they've seen it in their sales.
Very good. And so we're at CES. Obviously, it's only just started, so you've probably not even had time yet to go and sort of see and feel what's happening here. But what would you say your hopes are for what you will see here?
Gosh, I mean, in terms of this topic around inclusivity, I mean, I think we were talking about this yesterday. I think we're both, certainly myself, looking for more and more evidence that this is taking hold.
Yeah.
That it's more than just the talk, right?
Yeah. An add-on.
Because there's a little bit of this D&I bullet point thing that I think is happening. And add-on, you said it, we say it a lot, is inclusivity cannot be an add-on. It's a core component. And you can't come back from it either. I think once you kind of flip that bit, to use a technical term, it's very difficult to walk it back, and you really are changed on the other side of that. And I don't mean to be controversial, but there's very little evidence of that yet at this show right now. I think there's a little bit of top line talking about, but I would hope that starting this year with a little bit of this, what you guys are doing here on this stage is evidence, but there needs to be so much more.
Yeah. Christina?
Yeah, I agree. I was really disappointed by looking at the lineup that only the female quotient is talking about inclusivity. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's very, very sad, especially because it's, an $8.6 million disposable income market. Some of the largest innovations have been led by inclusivity. It just seems like a huge loss, and I think it's really a business imperative that people start thinking about it. And I'm sad to see that they aren't really as much.
Mm-hmm. So if there's one thing that everyone could take away and start doing tomorrow, what would that be? Christina?
I would say just really looking at your advertising, looking at the imagery that you're putting out, and making sure that it actually represents the world correctly. I think we're very much a visual society, and that's something that I think you can actually make those changes very quickly.
And maybe I would try and be a little bit different on that one and add to it and go, start listening and paying attention to how much more opportunity there is for inclusivity in everything you're doing. From the meetings you're holding, when you hold a meeting now, and so many of us hold our meetings with 3/4 of our participants participating digitally.
Yeah.
Just the notion of including those people, asking for opinions, and starting to really pay attention to how often and how easy it is to miss and walk past opportunities to include. Because I think as you start at that kind of baseline, almost molecular level, it starts to reflect in everything you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I'm conscious of time. We've got a few minutes left if anyone wants to ask a question.
Quick question. When you think about inclusivity and remote workers, remote office people, how do you think about that? Because as you were talking about your team being digital, it kind of sparked in me, sometimes you don't know if there is, something that can be done if a remote worker that maybe you don't see more than once a year or something like that. So how do you think about it, deal with it?
Well, using Teams is a very effective way.
I like that. I like that.
Thank you. No, but setting that aside, I'd jump in and say, hey, look, there are some things that you can do. One is if you're using any kind of group kind of calling, the features are now kind of helping people be inclusive. We record all our meetings now and post them on a team site so people can go back and kind of capture all of that. As a manager or a team or a meeting leader, making sure that you're asking for the folks on the phone to make a contribution if they haven't butt in, because a lot of times if you're the remote caller, you know how hard it is to break in. Just habits like that make a huge difference. And again, I think starts to spur this virtuous cycle of people just being more empathetic, right? And a little bit more aware.
Yeah.
I think you just ask beforehand. A lot of the times when I set up a meeting and I don't know that person well, I'll say, is there anything that I should take into consideration? Even with new moms, should I not book meetings from 6 to 8? Because I think that when you work better with others, the work is just better. And I think what's really great about Teams is that, I don't know if everyone saw the BBC broadcaster whose child ran in the back. On Teams, you can blur out the background. So you could be sitting in your PJs or at a coffee shop or in Vegas, and no one will know where you are. And that's also good for people with autism that get distracted with backgrounds.
Yes.
I love that.
Hi, I love the topic of empathy, and I think that's, for me, it's the softer side of this conversation, and I'm just curious on the harder side with compliance. I know for Microsoft in products, that's real before you could ship something. I'm just wondering what the panel thinks of the role of the compliance function versus the everything else we've talked about.
Well, I mean, I think, look, there's a lot of stuff that we're doing now from an inclusion perspective that goes beyond the boundaries of compliance. But in a lot of ways, I think maybe what you're asking or intuing in your question isn't all this stuff kind of inevitable? Isn't that where society is going? I think we certainly think it is. And this idea of kind of getting as far ahead of that as you can is in your best interest from a business case perspective, right? And I think, to your point about the softer versus harder, it's not just compliance, because I think even at Microsoft, some of the things that we've been doing, again, I'd say the Xbox controller as a driver for actual sales has been extraordinarily measurable.
Mm-hmm.
Christina, I have a question or some advice from you. Thank you so much for this. I'm here with Shell and super happy to be a partner with Wunderman Thompson. As we move forward, I'm looking for your kind of opinion or advice. If we were to start showcasing more diversity in our imagery, whether that's from a disability or a non-English speaker, but we don't have the customer experience on site to match that, how do we kind of start slow moving forward, and kind of where do you see us beginning?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can sit together and look at the entire CX and say, okay, this is where we can do the short wins. I think it's, even though, your website is not fully compliant yet, getting the imagery is good. I think it's small baby steps, but it's the brands that completely ignore it are the ones that are not just going to do well in the future. So after this, we can totally look at it and think about different baby steps. Because when I look at compliance, I think if compliance is just the bottom, it's illegal to not be accessible. And the lawsuits are increasing by 700% year over year. So that's just the basis, but we can do so much more like imagery. So we can definitely talk after this and we can think of some cool stuff.
The one thing I would add to that, just for whatever it's worth, is I think from our perspective, this notion of basing in reality, so the stories that you're telling, the imagery you're using to the fullest extent you can, if it can be based in reality rather than creating the reality, which is kind of a historic advertising and marketing thing to do, create the reality visually and then fill it in with the actual experience. If thinking about it in just the reverse, as using the case as the source of the content, I think you get a lot more credit and more forgiveness in terms of not pointing to that gap.
All right. I want to end and thank Bob and Christina for their time and a great discussion. And also, I just want to point out that sitting up here has warmed me up. I was freezing from the moment I got here at like 8:30 this morning, and just here now, I am toasty. So if you need to be warming up, come and sit here for 5 minutes. You'll be all good. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great discussion.